The medieval world believed the sky was finished, complete, closed, perfectly arranged by divine order. People did not expect anything new to appear there. And yet the earliest eyewitness accounts that sound like science fiction begin not on the ground, but above it, with lights, shapes, and movements that medieval observers could not explain, did not exaggerate, and recorded with visible discomfort. These were not dreams. They were not visions during prayer. They happened in open fields, during travel, while working, while praying, while surrounded by others who saw the same thing. The chroniclers did not want to write these things. But they did. One of the oldest accounts comes from an English monastery, where monks were responsible for tracking celestial events. Their job was not imagination. It was observation. They recorded eclipses, comets, star movements and planetary cycles with extreme seriousness. Errors meant spiritual consequences. Which is why a brief entry from the 11th century stands out. The monk wrote that burning wheel appeared in the daylight sky. It did not trail smoke, it did not fall. It rotated slowly, hovering, then divided into several smaller lights before reforming. The sky was clear. The sun was visible. The event lasted long enough for multiple monks to leave their work and observe it together. They argued quietly about whether to ring the bells. They chose not to. The wheel vanished without fading. No explanation followed. Years later, another monastery in France recorded something eerily similar. A shining object described as a shield of fire moved silently across the sky, stopped, and remained fixed above a river. Villagers gathered. Animals panicked. Birds fled. The object reflected sunlight but did not glow like flame. When night came, it was still there, then it moved straight upward and disappeared. No meteor behaves this way. The chronicler wrote that what disturbed him most was not the object, but the silence. No wind, no sound, no thunder. Just motion. Medieval people expected signs from the sky to announce themselves. This did not, in Germany. Soldiers marching between towns reported seeing a formation of lights traveling together in perfect alignment. The lights altered speed simultaneously, turned together, and stopped together. The soldiers believed at first it was a reflection from weapons or shields. Until the lights turned toward them. One soldier dropped to his knees. Convinced he was being watched. The lights hovered briefly, then accelerated away faster than any bird. The report was sent up the chain of command, then quietly archived. Nothing more was said. Even more unsettling are accounts where the sky behaved not as a surface but as depth. In an Italian chronicle, witnesses described seeing what looked like layers behind the sky, like fabric pulled back slightly. Colors shifted. Stars appeared where no stars should be visible. Shapes moved behind the blue, faint but deliberate. One monk wrote that it felt like seeing behind the world. He stopped sleeping afterward. These events were not rare. They repeat across centuries. In Ireland, fishermen recorded glowing objects entering the sea without splashing. They descended vertically, leaving no disturbance. The water closed above them as if nothing had passed. Minutes later, the sea glowed faintly from below. The glow moved, then vanished. Fish returned unharmed. Water remembers disturbance. These waters did not. Children noticed these things first. Children pointed at the sky and asked why. The stars were moving wrong. Adults laughed until they looked up. In one village, children described fire birds flying without wings. The adults scolded them. That night, several villagers witnessed the same shapes crossing the sky in silence. No feathers, no flapping, no sound. Just controlled movement. Monks struggled to fit these events into theology. Angels did not behave like this. Comets did not stop and turn. Stars did not descend and rise again. Some tried to label these signs as divine warnings. But the behavior did not match any known omen. There was no plague afterward, no war, no prophecy fulfilled. The events stood alone, observation without conclusion. That troubled them deeply. One monk wrote that the lights seemed to observe human gatherings, appearing more often during festivals, markets, or battles. Another noted that the objects changed behavior when bells rang. Sound mattered. When bells rang, the lights moved away. This detail appears again and again, as if the objects responded to vibration. In a particularly chilling account, a monk let one light descended low enough to illuminate the ground beneath it. Grass did not burn. Shadows bent unnaturally. The monk felt pressure in his head, not pain, but awareness, an overwhelming sense of being noticed. He prayed aloud. The light rose immediately and vanished. He never wrote again. Other chroniclers recorded physical effects. Metal objects vibrated faintly. Animals froze in place. Milk soared. Time felt distorted, minutes stretching into something longer, heavier. One man swore the sun did not move while the object hovered. That should not be possible. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. Medieval people were not ignorant of the sky. They knew its rhythms intimately. They noticed when something broke pattern. And pattern, breaking terrified them. What makes these accounts feel like science fiction is not the lights themselves, but the behavior. Controlled motion, silent hovering, instant acceleration, reaction to cell reactions in human activity. These are not random phenomena. These are not natural accidents. Yet medieval chroniclers did not invent explanations. They did not describe machines or travelers from elsewhere. They simply recorded what they saw and what they felt. Fear, confusion, humility. One chronicler wrote something remarkable. He suggested that humans might not be the only observers of the world. That sentence should not exist in medieval writing. But it does. Another wrote that the sky is not empty space, but a place. A place implies occupants. Across centuries, these sky events repeat with consistent characteristics. They appear briefly. They do not communicate openly. They do not remain. They do not explain themselves. They behave like visitors who do not wish to be noticed, but are not concerned if they are. Modern science fiction imagines surveillance, probe watchers, advanced intelligences observing early civilizations. Medieval people had no such framework. Yet their eyewitness accounts describe exactly that feeling. Being watched. The most disturbing part is not what they saw, but what they concluded quietly. They did not conclude the sky was dangerous. They concluded it was active. That the universe was not passive. That something moved above them with intention. And that humanity was not the center of attention, only part of the scenery. That realization sits beneath every line of these early records. It is why the writing is careful, restrained, almost fearful of saying too much. Because once you accept that the sky can move, stop, respond, and observe, you must accept that medieval people were not alone. Not even then. And if they were not alone in the 9th century, then the question is not whether these things existed. The question is why they were already there. Long before humans learned to look back. Medieval people believed the ground beneath their feet was stable. Earth was supposed to be the one thing that did not lie. It cracked during earthquakes, yes, but it did not change its nature. Hills stayed hills, valleys stayed valleys. Forests grew slowly, rivers followed known paths. So when medieval eyewitnesses recorded landscapes that appeared suddenly, behaved incorrectly, and then vanished, it disturbed them more deeply than lights in the sky ever could. Because the sky was distant. The land was personal. The earliest accounts speak of places that did not exist yesterday but stood fully formed today. Not slowly built, not grown, simply present. In a 10th century Frankish record, a group of farmers traveling a familiar road encountered a valley none then recognized. It was wide, green, perfectly shaped, with flowers blooming out of season. A clear stream ran through its center. They stood in silence, confused. They knew this land. They had crossed it weekly for years. The valley had never been there. One man stepped inside. The air felt warmer, sound softened. His companions described him moving strangely as if slowed. He waved, smiling, and continued walking. Minutes passed. Then hours. They called for him. No answer. When he finally emerged, night had fallen. He insisted he had wandered only briefly. He described seeing buildings in the distance, tall and bright, though none existed there. He never returned to that road again. The chronicler noted the valley vanished the next day. In England, monks recorded a forest that appeared between two villages after a violent but brief storm. Trees stood tall, mature, tightly packed, as if they had grown for decades. Paths existed between them, paths in play use. Villagers entered to cut wood. Inside, sound behaved oddly. Axes struck trees but echoed incorrectly. Some men felt watched. One man wandered off and did not return until 3 days later. Though he believed only an hour had passed. The forest was gone by then. In Germany, soldiers marching near the border. In Germany, a hill that should not have been there. Maps showed flat land. Local guides swore no hill existed. Yet it stood before them casting a shadow. They climbed it cautiously. At the top the view was wrong. The horizon bent unnaturally. Distant villages appeared closer than possible. A horn sounded from nowhere. The soldiers panicked and fled. The hill was gone when scouts returned. Chroniclers began noticing patterns. These impossible landscapes often appeared near boundaries, borders between regions, edges of forests, river crossings, crossroads, coastlines. Places already considered uncertain. In Ireland, fishermen described an island appearing offshore at dawn. It was large, rocky, with visible cliffs. Boats sailed toward it. As they approached, the island seemed to retreat. No matter how long they rowed, the distance never closed. By midday, the island faded like mist. The sea was empty again. This happened more than once. Monks recorded it carefully. In Italy, travelers reported walking into towns that did not exist on any map. Streets were clean, buildings unfamiliar, people oddly dressed but human. The travelers felt disoriented. Lightheaded, calm, they were welcomed. Fed. Then, after resting, they stepped outside and found themselves alone on an empty road, the town gone entirely. Food remained in their stomachs. Time had passed differently. These accounts terrified church authorities. Because hallucinations do not feed you. One of the most disturbing categories involves landscapes that respond to human behavior. A Spanish chronicle describes a meadow that appeared after sunset. Those who entered quietly felt peace. Those who argued or panicked felt intense fear and were driven back by unseen pressure. The meadow vanished at sunrise. In France, a traveler described entering a valley where sound did not travel correctly. Shouting produced no echo. Whispering carried far. He felt his thoughts slow. He left quickly. The valley was never found again. Some monks suggested these places were spiritual tests. Others quietly disagreed. One wrote that these landscapes felt functional, not symbolic. They had paths, structures, boundaries. They were not visions. They were word matters. Environments imply habitation. Another chilling pattern emerged. These places often reused familiar elements, trees, rivers, buildings, but arranged them incorrectly. Angles felt wrong. Distances collapsed. Colors were slightly off. As if something was copying reality imperfectly. In a German account, a valley contained sheep that did not behave like sheep. They watched travelers. They moved in silence. When approached, they scattered without sound. The traveler fled, the valley vanished. Children again perceived these places more easily. Children pointed toward empty hills and insisted villages were there. Children described paths adults could not see. When adults followed, they felt disoriented but saw nothing. Some children vanished briefly and returned changed, quieter, thoughtful, reluctant to speak. Parents were terrified. Animals reacted strongly. Horses refused to enter certain areas. Dogs growled at empty air. Birds avoided newly appeared forests. Animals sensed something wrong. Monks recorded physical effects. Compasses, when available, spun. Shadows fell incorrectly, timekeeping failed. Candles burned unevenly. In one monastery, a meadow appeared near the cloister. Monks debated entering. They prayed instead. The meadow remained until bells rang for mass. Then it vanished instantly. Sound again. Always sound. One monk dared to speculate that these landscapes were not created but revealed. As if something normally hidden became briefly visible. Another suggested the world was layered, and sometimes layers touched. That idea should not exist in medieval thought. Yet it does. Perhaps the most frightening account comes from Eastern Europe. A caravan passed through a valley that seemed ordinary. Halfway through, the air thickened. Sound dulled. Colors shifted. At the far end, the landscape was different. Mountains where plains should be. A cold sun, strange birds. They turned back immediately. When they emerged, weeks had passed. They had not aged. Their supplies were untouched. The valley could not be found again. Chroniclers struggled to conclude anything. They did not call these places heaven or hell. They did not call them illusions. They simply recorded that the land itself sometimes lied. Modern science fiction speaks of alternate dimensions, pocket realities, parallel worlds overlapping briefly. Medieval people had no such language. But they described the experience with painful clarity. Stepping into a place that feels real, behaves real, but does not belong. The final note in one French chronicle is quietly devastating. The monk wrote that if land can appear and disappear, then maps are only guesses. Borders are temporary. Ownership is an illusion. The world is not fixed, it moves. Shifts, reveals pieces of itself when it chooses, and humanity walks across it believing it understands. Until the ground itself proves otherwise. Medieval people trusted the night sky, but they trusted the stars even. More stars were fixed. They were anchors. Monks memorized them, sailors relied on them, farmers planned seasons by them. Stars did not move freely, they followed rules older than kingdoms. Which is why medieval eyewitness accounts describing stars that moved with intention, shook people more deeply than comets, or eclipses ever could. Because comets followed arcs. Eclipses followed cycles. But these stars behaved like living things. One of the earliest records comes from a monastery in southern France. During night prayers, monks noticed a star drifting slowly across the sky, not like a planet. It stopped. Stopped completely. The monks debated quietly. One ran to fetch others. When they returned, the star was still there, unmoving, brighter than before. Then it descended. Not falling, descending. The chronicler wrote that it moved. As a lantern lowered by an unseen hand. It reached a point just above the horizon and hovered. Dogs began howling across the countryside. The star rose again and vanished. No trail, no smoke, no explanation. Years later, a nearly identical account appears in England. This time multiple stars moved together. They formed a pattern, broke apart, then reformed. Witnesses described them, playing. A word the chronicler hesitated to use. Stars should not play. In Germany, soldiers on night watch observed a star that pulsed rhythmically, bright, dim, bright like a heartbeat. Each pulse was identical in timing. One soldier counted the rhythm. It did not match breathing. It did not match prayer. It did not match anything human. When the soldier pointed it out, the star changed color slightly. The men fell silent. Then it moved sideways and vanished. Movement sideways is crucial. Medieval observers knew the sky well enough to know what sideways movement meant. It meant intention. In Italy, sailors recorded stars that dipped into the sea and emerged again. They expected splashes, there were none. The water closed perfectly above the point of entry. Moments later, a glow appeared beneath the surface, traveling slowly, deliberately before disappearing. Fish were unharmed. The sea was calm. Water should remember disruption. It did not. Children noticed the stars behaving wrongly before adults did. Children asked why stars were following them during evening walks. Parents laughed until they looked up and realized one star remained directly overhead, no matter where they moved. When the family stopped, the star stopped. When they walked again, it followed. They ran inside. The star drifted away. Monks recorded multiple accounts of stars appearing inside clouds without illuminating them. Clouds should glow if light passes through. These clouds did not. The stars inside them moved. In Ireland, Witnesses described stars descending close enough to illuminate fields without heat. Shadows bent oddly. Colors looked wrong. People felt pressure in their ears and chest. One man fainted. When he awoke, hours had passed. Stars were also seen emerging from the horizon. Not rising like celestial bodies but appearing suddenly, as if switching on. In Spain, chroniclers run a 3 stars appearing in perfect alignment above a village. They remained for an entire night. Villagers prayed. At dawn, the stars moved straight upward together and vanished. No astronomer could explain it. Some monks attempted calculations. They failed. Others noted something more disturbing. These stars reacted to human activity. They appeared during battles, during large gatherings, during moments of fear or celebration. They avoided empty places. One monk wrote that the stars seemed curious. Curiosity implies mind. In one chilling account, a star split into 2, then 3, then merged again. This happened slowly, visibly, deliberately. Stars do not divide. Modern science fiction would call this maneuvering, replication, or controlled flight. Medieval people simply wrote that the sky behaved wrongly. A German chronicle describes a star that descended into a forest. Witnesses followed at a distance. The forest glowed faintly, no fire, no heat, just light. When the star rose again, the forest returned to darkness. Several trees were scorched but not burned. Scorching without fire should not exist. Even more disturbing are accounts of stars communicating. Not with words. With timing. A monk described praying silently when a star brightened suddenly. When he stopped praying, it dimmed. He repeated the test. The star responded each time. He recorded this reluctantly. He never mentioned it again. Stars were also seen forming shapes: crosses, circles, wheel spirals. One chronicler in Italy described tracing a symbol repeatedly until dawn. The symbol was unfamiliar. When drawn on parchment later, no one recognized it. The chronicler destroyed the drawing. Fear outweighed curiosity. In England, stars were seen moving beneath the clouds, not above them. They cast shadows upward. Shadows upward should not exist. In one account, villagers heard a faint humming while stars moved. The sound was not wind. Animals reacted strongly. Cows lay down and refused to rise. Birds fled before the stars appeared. Animals sensed it first. Always. Monks noticed another pattern. Stars appeared more often near places where other anomalies occurred. Moving roads, time slips, voices without bodies, strange weather. The same regions. The same boundaries. As if the sky and the land were connected by something unseen. One monk dared to suggest that stars were not distant lights but openings. That idea terrified him. Because if stars were openings, then something might be looking through them. The most disturbing account comes from a monastery in Central Europe. A star descended slowly into the cloister courtyard. Monks watched from windows frozen. The star hovered just above the ground, illuminating the stones. One monk claimed he felt thoughts that were not his own. Questions. Not words, curiosity. The star rose and vanished. The monk fell ill afterward. He survived, but he refused to sleep under open sky again. The chronicler ended with a sentence that feels heavy even now. He wrote that stars are not decorations. They are not distant fires. They are participants. Participants in what, he did not say. Medieval people did not imagine spacecraft or visitors from elsewhere. But they knew when something behaved with purpose. These stars did. They moved, they stopped, they responded, they observed. And worst of all, they behaved as if humanity was not new to them. As if humans were not the first to notice. As if the sky had always been watching, and medieval people had simply looked up at the wrong moment. Medieval people believed the world had borders. Land ended at the sea. The sky ended at the stars, life ended at death. Time, however, was supposed to flow straight forward, steady, unquestionable. Which is why eyewitness accounts of time behaving wrongly disturbed medieval minds more than monsters, plagues or wars ever did. Time was God's domain. And yet, time began to slip. The earliest recorded account comes from a small village near the Alps. A shepherd left his home at sunrise to lead his flock into the hills. He returned believing only an hour had passed. The village bells told a different story. 3 days. The shepherd insisted he had not slept, his beard had not grown. His food pouch was untouched. His sheep were calm unfazed, as if no time had passed for them either. The villagers examined the hills. Nothing had changed. The shepherd swore he had heard distant bells while grazing, bells that did not exist. Monks wrote that time had folded. They did not like that word. In England, a similar story appears centuries later. A man entered a forest to hunt a deer he had wounded. He followed the animal into a mist-filled hollow. The mist closed behind him. When he emerged, the forest looked familiar but wrong. Trees had grown thicker, paths were gone. The village he returned to did not recognize him. His name was known, his face was not. 50 years had passed. The man aged rapidly over the following weeks, as if time was reclaiming its debt. He died begging priests to explain where the years had gone. They could not. In monasteries, bells governed life. Prayer hours structured existence. When bells rang incorrectly, it was noticed immediately. One monastery recorded bells ringing for matins twice in one night, without being touched. The monks prayed again. Later they realized the night had lasted unnaturally long. Dawn came late. The sun rose slowly, as if delayed. No cloud cover. No eclipse, just time hesitating. In Germany, soldiers reported marching for hours without fatigue, until suddenly collapsing all at once. When they awoke, their campfires were cold, and their rations spoiled. They had marched for 2 days. Their bodies had felt only minutes. Some people experienced the opposite. A woman in France stepped outside to fetch water. She returned moments later screaming aged. Her hair gray, her hands shaking. She claimed she had lived an entire lifetime in a place that looked like her village, but quieter, slower, empty. She had married. She had grown old. She had died. Then she was back. She lived only a few days after. Medieval chroniclers struggled to describe these events. They lacked language for temporal displacement, time dilation, or parallel timelines. They used phrases like, borrowed years, lost hours, stolen days. In Italy, a monk described sitting in prayer when candle flames froze mid-flicker. Smoke hung motionless. Sound vanished, he could move. The world could not. He prayed until sensation returned. No time had passed, or too much had. In Ireland, fishermen entered a fog bank at sea. Inside, the ocean was still, no wind, no waves. Light was diffuse, directionless. They heard singing. Not from above. From beneath the water. When they escaped the fog, they found their nets rotted, their boat aged, and their village abandoned. Decades had passed. The villagers believed them dead. Some monks suspected these were not punishments, but intersections. Places where time overlapped itself. Thin places, boundaries. One monastery kept records of a meadow where animals aged faster. Sheep grazing there developed gray wool rapidly. Trees near it showed rings too close together. Time rang faster there. Nearby, a cave existed where torches burned without shortening. Time ran slower inside. People anomalies followed patterns. They occurred near ancient ruins, near standing stones, near crossroads, places already believed to be liminal. One chilling account describes a child who vanished during play and returned speaking of things scribed yet invented. He described metal birds, glowing rooms, voices without bodies. The priests wrote this down, then sealed the record. They feared heresy, but fear could not stop repetition. A monk in Spain recorded seeing the same traveler arrive at an inn twice in one evening. Wearing different clothes, different expressions. The two versions of the man noticed each other. Both screamed. One vanished. The other fainted. In another case, villagers watched a man walk down a road and vanish mid-step. The air rippled. Moments later the man reappeared, screaming, then aged visibly and collapsed. He died within minutes. Time had crushed him. Clocks did not exist as we know them, but sundials were trusted. When shadows behaved wrongly, panic followed. Shadows sometimes moved backward. Sometimes stopped entirely. sometimes split. Monks wrote that the sun hesitated, they feared Judgment Day. But judgment never came, only confusion. Perhaps the most unsettling account comes from a monastery, where monks recorded the same day repeating they prayed. They ate, they slept. Then woke to the same bells. Same meals. Same weather. Same words spoken by the abbot. One monk changed his actions deliberately, the world corrected him, he woke again, eventually, the repetition ended. None of them ever spoke of it again. They recorded it once. Then burned the rest. Because if time could loop, then fate could be edited. That idea was unbearable. Some medieval thinkers quietly suggested that time was not a river, but a landscape. And sometimes, people stepped into valleys or climbed ridges without realizing it. Science fiction would later describe time as relative, elastic, observer, dependent. Medieval people only knew something was wrong. They felt it in their bones. In their sleep. In their sudden aging. In their missing years. One monk ended his chronicle with a warning, not a prayer. He wrote that the world is not broken. It is layered. And sometimes those layers touch. When they do, stars move strangely, roads walk, voices appear, and time forgets its direction. Medieval people did not imagine machines bending time. They believed time itself was alive, and like any living thing, it could hesitate, wander, or bite. Medieval people believed the human body was fragile. Flesh decayed, bones weakened, illness followed invisible rules set by God. Which is why accounts of bodies behaving in impossible ways terrified witnesses more than ghosts or demons ever could. A spirit could lie. A body could not. And yet bodies began to disobey reality. The earliest record comes from a monastery infirmary in northern Italy. A man was brought in with a deep chest wound. The monks prepared him for last rites. Blood soaked the linen, breathing was shallow. Then the wound closed, not slowly, not naturally, it sealed itself. The skin pulled together without scar, without swelling, without pain. The man sat up, confused, asking why everyone looked afraid. The monks recorded it as a miracle. But privately they disagreed. Miracles healed. This felt like correction. In France, villagers described a woman crushed beneath a collapsed wall. Witnesses saw her bones bend unnaturally instead of breaking. When the stones were removed, she stood up, uninjured, her body trembling as if confused by its own survival. She refused to speak of what she felt. She lived another 40 years. Her bones, when examined after death, showed irregular thickness, as if reinforced. Medieval chroniclers often wrote of saints whose bodies resisted decay. But these were holy men and women. What terrified people were ordinary villagers whose bodies refused to follow rules. A man in England fell from a church tower. Witnesses heard the impact. They ran to collect his remains. He stood up, his legs were twisted briefly, then straightened. One witness vomited. Another fainted. The man walked home. Days later, his legs began to ache intensely. The pain never stopped. It was as if his body remembered the fall, but too late. In Germany, soldiers reported wounds that vanished during battle, only to reappear days later while sleeping. One soldier woke screaming as an arrow wound reopened violently. Blood pouring out as if time had rewound. He died within minutes. The arrow was not present. In Spain, a monk described a man whose shadow did not match his body. The shadow lagged slightly behind, like a delayed reflection. At first, people thought it was imagination. Then the shadow began to move independently. The man fell ill shortly afterward and died staring at the wall, begging his shadow to stop watching him. Medieval medicine believed the body and soul were connected directly. If the body changed, the soul must have been touched. But some bodies changed without any spiritual explanation. In one disturbing case, a child was born with eyes that reflected light differently. Torches did not flicker in them, they appeared absorbed. The child reacted calmly to fire, cold, pain. He grew unusually fast. At age 10 he stopped aging. He died suddenly at what should have been 30, but his body looked unchanged from childhood. The monks buried him quietly. They wrote only one sentence. His flesh forgot time. In another account, villagers encountered a man who claimed he did not feel hunger. He ate only out of habit. Weeks passed without food. He did not weaken. When forced to fast under observation, he showed no change. Eventually he began to glow faintly in darkness, not visibly, subtly. Enough to make people uncomfortable. They asked him to leave. Bodies also began appearing in the wrong places. A fisherman drowned off the coast of Scotland. His body was recovered and buried inland. Days later, his body was found again floating at sea. Perfectly preserved, identical, the grave was still filled. 2 bodies. Same man. The priests reburied both, neither decayed. In monasteries, monks documented people who healed too precisely, broken bones reset perfectly. As if aligned by design rather than chance. Scars vanished. Birthmarks moved. One monk's birthmark slowly migrated across her skin over years. Skin should not move. In France, a knight was struck through the abdomen by a spear. Witnesses saw the weapon pass completely through him. He continued fighting. After the battle, no wound could be found. Days later, he began coughing blood, not from the abdomen but from the lungs. The spear had chosen a different exit. People also described bodies ignoring gravity. A monk recorded a man who fell asleep leaning against a wall, and remained upright all night without support. When touched, he toppled normally. In Italy, witnesses saw a woman collapse in grief, and hover inches above the ground for several moments before falling. She screamed that the ground would not accept her. Medieval thinkers had no concept of altered physics. They only knew something was interfering. Some bodies became wrongly heavy. Men could not be lifted by multiple people. Others became strangely light. A child was carried by the wind during a storm, landing unharmed far from home. Parents never let him outside again. One of the most chilling accounts involves pain behaving incorrectly. A man burned his hand in a forge. He felt nothing. Later that night, he screamed as pain struck suddenly, overwhelming him. Pain delayed. As if stored. As if cued. Bodies also seemed to resist death. People pronounced dead returned hours later gasping. Not resurrection. Correction. A monk described opening its eyes during burial preparations, sitting upright, confused, and asking why everyone was crying. He lived but he changed. He claimed the world looked crieder, colors dulled, sounds distant. He avoided mirrors. When asked why, he said reflections lagged. In England, a woman gave birth to a child who did not cry, breathe, or move yet lived. Its chest did not rise. Its skin was warm. It reacted to touch. After 3 days it began breathing suddenly and screamed for hours. The midwives fainted. Bodies sometimes synchronized with external events. A monk recorded that wounds reopened during certain star movements. Others noted feversing during strange lights. The body seemed to respond to the sky. This terrified the church, because if bodies responded to stars, then heaven was not distant. It was involved. Perhaps the most disturbing case involves a man whose body appeared to reset. Villagers recognized him aging normally. One day he disappeared. Years later, he returned, younger, not reborn. Not a son, the same man, same scar, same voice, same memories until after that point, nothing. His body had returned. His time had not. The chronicler wrote that the man looked at his own aging parents like strangers. Bodies also began producing substances unknown to medicine. Sweat that smelled metallic. Blood that clotted instantly in air. Skin that resisted cutting. One monk attempted surgery and found the blade slid away as if repelled. He dropped the knife and prayed. Animals reacted violently to these people. Dogs growled, horses refused approach, cats stared endlessly. Animals sensed wrongness always first. In monasteries, monks debated quietly whether bodies were being tested indicate divine power or something else. One monk wrote a dangerous thought. He suggested the body might be modifiable. That terrified him. Because if bodies could be modified, then humanity was not fixed. Not finished. Just a version. Medieval science fiction did not exist. But medieval fear did. Fear that humans were not stable. Fear that something was experimenting. Fear that flesh was a surface, not a truth. The chapter ends with a final account. A monk recorded seeing his own reflection blink independently. Days later he felt his heart stop, then restart. He lived. But he ended his chronicle abruptly. No prayer. No explanation. Only a sentence written in shaking hand. The body is not what we were promised. Medieval people believed the forests were alive. Not in belief that flowers bloom or rivers flow, but in the sense that trees were witnesses, guardians of the land, capable of reflecting the divine order. Wanderers knew which paths were safe, which glades to avoid, which streams would betray them with unseen whirlpools. And yet, eyewitness accounts describe forests that behaved incorrectly, forests that moved, rearranged themselves, and seemed to respond to human presence. The earliest record comes from a monastery in northern Germany. Monks traveling to collect herbs found themselves walking the same path repeatedly, though the trail seemed familiar. A small copse appeared ahead, though they had walked this route daily for months. They tried to step around it, but it shifted. Trees moved subtly, trunks bending in ways that should have been impossible, roots rising briefly to block passage. When they stopped, the copse froze in place. When they moved again it reassembled, as if the forest was aware of their intentions. The monks whispered prayers, crossed themselves and walked on cautiously, marking the trees with chalk. Later they returned and the marks were gone. In France, shepherds described glades that appeared at dawn and vanished by sunset. Animals refused to enter. Sheep bleated nervously at invisible walls. Birds circled the perimeter but never landed. A shepherd ventured inside and described feeling, watched from all sides at once. He emerged hours later, though he insisted he had only walked a few steps. His hair had frost where none should have been. His eyes were wide, haunted. In England, chroniclers recorded trees that rearranged themselves while villagers slept. Paths leading to the village would shift, taking travelers in unfamiliar directions. Gates to familiar fields appeared in new locations. Livestock wandered into strange enclosures. People sometimes arrived at distant towns without noticing the time it took. Days vanished, nights lengthened, hours collapsed. The forests were manipulating not just space, but time itself in Italy. A forest near a river was described as breathing. The air moved unnaturally, the leaves rustled without wind, shadows stretched and shrank independently. Monks entering the grove reported seeing lights darting between trunks, tiny glowing forms that mimicked human movement. They called them spirits. But their behavior was wrong. Too deliberate. Too controlled. In Spain, witnesses described a dark forest path where footprints would disappear behind them. Travelers tried to follow tracks left by companions. Tracks vanished after a few steps, leaving only blank earth. Sound also betrayed them. Voices called out, but were not echoes. Footsteps approached when no one was near. Leaves crunched silently beneath feet. Bells rang faintly far from their origin. A group of villagers attempting to flee reported that no matter which direction they ran, the path always led back to the forest center. Children were often first to notice. They would point toward thickets that adults claimed were empty. They would stare silently, describing shapes moving between trees that disappeared when anyone approached. Monks began recording the phenomenon systematically. They noted, forests did not move randomly. They reacted. The more a person feared, the more the forest shifted. The braver or more curious the observer, the calmer the forest became. Almost guiding. In Germany, soldiers on patrol noted the forest opening into small clearings that did not exist on any map. They described seeing stone ruins, partially buried, carved with symbols unknown to men. Some soldiers dared to approach, touching the stone. Their hands froze briefly, then tingled. They felt ideas not their own. Memories of events they had not lived. Battles in places far away. Cities that did not exist. When they returned to the village, they could not describe what they had seen in detail. The words felt wrong. The forests also seemed to manipulate perception. Colors shifted slightly when observed. Animals moved differently. Shadows bent at odd angles. Light behaved inconsistently, appearing and vanishing depending on the viewer's attention. In one chilling Irish account, travelers noticed that moss on the trees changed overnight. Patterns shifted, forming symbols or maps. Some believed these were directions. Others believed warnings. A monk entered the forest to investigate, and was later found wandering days away disoriented. He insisted he had walked only a short distance, yet he had crossed rivers and hills unfamiliar to all. Forests were also connected to celestial phenomena. Monks wrote that lights in the sky often preceded forest anomalies. Glowing orbs drifting into the treetops, hovering briefly before disappearing. Time anomalies frequently occurred within these woods. Villagers entered a glade at dawn, returned at dusk, and found that a week had passed for the outside world. Animals aged, children had grown, bread left on tables had molded. The forest did not just manipulate space. They manipulated time. In southern France, a dense woodland was described as responsive to prayer and ritual. Bells ringing near the trees would cause paths to straighten or widen. Sacred chants would slow time inside the forest. Ignorant laughter or quarrels would accelerate nightfall or create sudden storms. In Italy, a particular grove contained stones that emitted faint hums when touched. Monks described hearing whispers in Latin, but not words they understood. Some fainted. Others went temporarily blind. The forests also housed beings that were neither human nor animal. Descriptions vary: shadowed figures, glowing orbs, elongated silhouettes that observed silently. They never approached directly. They mimicked, reflected, or avoided. But their presence was felt. Animals reacted violently. Horses refused to enter. Dogs whimpered. Birds fled. Even fish leaped in rivers near these areas. In one German record, a group of children playing near a forest edge disappeared for hours. When they returned, they were unharmed but spoke cryptically about seeing the world shift sideways. About trees breathing like men. About shadows moving independently. Adults believed the children hallucinated. Adults were wrong. The forests often revealed mirages of towns, castles, or rivers that did not exist. Travelers reported paths leading to villages that vanished upon approach. People they met inside sometimes recognized them. Sometimes they did not exist. Monks recorded that the forest seemed to store human experience. Footprints would reappear days later, showing travelers who had never been there. Animal tracks would mimic human shapes. Voices repeated conversations long past. In Spain, one account tells of a man entering a forest to hunt a deer. He chased it for hours. When he returned, the village reported he had been gone a week, though he felt only minutes had passed. His rifle and clothing were intact. His dogs were unharmed. The forest had stolen time. In England, travelers encountered paths that led into the sky, or downward into valleys that did not exist. Some reported walking on flat paths, only to realize they were ascending cliffs without slope. The boundaries between the natural and the impossible blurred completely. Chroniclers began linking these events to celestial anomalies. Stars moved differently above these forests. Moonlight behaved incorrectly. Clouds would drift in impossible directions. Some monks suggested the forests were thin places, thresholds between the known and unknown, where the world's rules were temporarily suspended. One final account is particularly chilling. A monk entered a grove at night to meditate. He described the air thickening, sounds dulling, shadows stretching unnaturally. He saw a figure, indistinct, human-shaped, luminous yet dark. The figure watched silently. The monk prayed for hours. When he left, the figure remained. Months later he returned. The grove was gone. Only a meadow remained. He wrote, "The forest is alive, it sees, it remembers. It shapes the world as it chooses. We walk within it, but never on its terms." Medieval people believed water was predictable. Rivers flowed in steady courses. Lakes remained calm unless storms stirred them. Springs bubbled reliably. Yet eyewitness accounts describe waters behaving in ways that defied understanding. Waters that moved against gravity, appeared where they should not, or vanished entirely, leaving nothing but dry riverbeds. The earliest record comes from a monastery in northern Italy. A river known to flood annually behaved differently one spring. It split into two channels overnight, flowing in opposite directions around the same bend. Villagers crossed cautiously, expecting the current to be dangerous. They discovered that the water was strangely warm in one channel and icy in the other. Fish swam backward, ducks floated upside down. The sound of the current seemed reversed, gurgling upstream instead of down. Monks recorded the event meticulously. They had observed the river for decades. Nothing explained this behavior. In France, a lake near a village was described as shimmering with colors that did not exist in nature. Villagers approached to drink. But when they touched the surface, their hands passed through a thin barrier of water that felt solid. The lake shimmered with ripples that moved against the wind. Fish leapt in impossible patterns. Shadows reflected wrongly. A shepherd fell in, he disappeared. When he emerged he claimed he had been underwater for 3 days, though the village insisted only an hour had passed. The chronicler wrote that the lake had stolen time and stretched it, though no one understood how. In England, travelers reported a river that flowed uphill. They followed it to a waterfall that appeared from nowhere. Water fell, not downward but sideways, landing on flat rocks in a strange, perfect arrangement. The water disappeared immediately upon touching the rocks. Fish, leaves and branches vanished along with it. Witnesses described the air as vibrating with a subtle hum. Animals refused to cross, children wept, monks noted that rivers, lakes, and seas seemed to respond to celestial movements. Stars above affected currents, tides, and the behavior of water in ways that made no sense. In Germany, a man rowing along a familiar river noticed that the water beneath him glowed faintly, illuminating fish that appeared translucent. He leaned over to observe, but the glow dimmed when touched. Something below the surface reacted. Something intelligent. The man's dog barked constantly but refused to jump in. Fish followed the boat as if observing, then disappeared. In Spain, travelers saw rivers vanish entirely, leaving dry channels. When they attempted to cross, they stepped into mist instead of water. The mist felt wet. It smelled like damp earth. It flowed slowly around their legs. Some fell into it. They were never seen again. Others returned, claiming to have wandered in a world where land and water were the same. A place where rivers became solid and forests swam. Children noticed these anomalies first. They would approach streams and shout, "The water is walking backward." Adults dismissed them until they followed. Rivers also appeared in impossible locations. One chronicler described a waterway cutting through a dry hill, forming a natural canal. Fish leapt along the slope as if gravity were irrelevant. Medieval people believed water was predictable. Rivers flowed in steady courses. Lakes remained calm unless storms stirred them. Springs bubbled reliably. Yet eyewitness accounts describe waters behaving in ways that defied understanding. Waters that moved against gravity, appeared where they should not, or vanished entirely, leaving nothing but dry riverbeds. The earliest record comes from a monastery in northern Italy. A river known to flood annually behaved differently one spring. It split into two channels overnight, flowing in opposite directions around the same bend. Villagers crossed cautiously, expecting the current to be dangerous. They discovered that the water was strangely warm in one channel and icy in the other. Fish swam backward. Ducks floated upside down. The sound of the current seemed reversed, gurgling upstream instead of down. Monks recorded the event meticulously. They had observed the river for decades. Nothing explained this behavior. In France, a lake near a village was described as shimmering with colors that did not exist in nature. Villagers approached to drink. But when they touched the surface, their hands passed through a thin barrier of water that felt solid. The lake shimmered with ripples that moved against the wind. Fish leaped in impossible patterns. Shadows reflected wrongly. A shepherd fell in. He disappeared. When he emerged he claimed he had been underwater for 3 days. Though the village insisted only an hour had passed. The chronicler wrote that the lake had stolen time and stretched it, though no one understood how. In England, travelers reported a river that flowed uphill. They followed it to a waterfall that appeared from nowhere. Water fell, not downward, but sideways, landing on flat rocks in a strange, perfect arrangement. The water disappeared immediately upon touching the rocks. Fish, leaves, and branches vanished along with it. Witnesses described the air as vibrating with a subtle hum. Animals refused to cross, children wept. Monks noted that rivers, lakes, and seas seemed to respond to celestial movements. Stars above affected currents, tides, and the behavior of water in ways that made no sense. In Germany, a man rowing along a familiar river noticed that the water beneath him glowed faintly, illuminating fish that appeared translucent. He leaned over to observe, but the glow dimmed when touched. Something below the surface reacted. Something intelligent. The man's dog barked constantly but refused to jump in. Fish followed the boat as if observing, then disappeared. In Spain, travelers saw rivers vanish entirely, leaving dry channels. When they attempted to cross, they stepped into mist instead of water. The mist felt wet, it smelled like damp earth, it flowed slowly around their legs. Some fell into it, they were never seen again. Others returned, claiming to have wandered in a world where land and water were the same. A place where rivers became solid and forests swam. Children noticed these anomalies first. They would approach streams and shout, "The water is walking backward." Adults dismissed them until they followed. Rivers also appeared in impossible locations. One chronicler described a waterway cutting through a dry hill, forming a natural canal. Fish leapt along the slope as if gravity were irrelevant. Bridges collapsed when crossed, but travelers were unharmed. One monk suggested that water could be a living entity, capable of choosing paths, testing humans, and observing behavior. This idea terrified clergy because water was a symbol of purity. If water could act independently, then God's order was uncertain. In Ireland, a fisherman described entering fog over the sea. The water became glassy, reflecting a sky that did not exist. Boats drifted without current. Fish swam above them, sounds echoed strangely, cries of birds, bells, human voices, yet no source existed. When the fisherman returned to open water, hours had passed, though he felt only minutes had elapsed. His catch was missing, the sea had swallowed it. In Italy, chroniclers recorded waves moving without wind, forming patterns that resembled symbols. Villagers interpreted them as warnings, sailors ignored them. Some ships disappeared. Others returned with crew who insisted the ocean was alive, observing, judging, and playing with them. Water often acted as a bridge. Rivers flowed where they should not. Lakes reflected stars incorrectly, and seas revealed impossible islands. One account describes a small island appearing suddenly in the Adriatic. Its trees were familiar but arranged oddly. Flowers bloomed out of season. Birds circled but never landed. Fishermen approached to investigate. When they stepped ashore, the island vanished. Only a faint reflection remained on the water. In Germany, a river split into multiple channels during the night. Travelers followed one and found it leading to a village that did not exist. The village people speaking languages unknown. Their food was unfamiliar. Their houses impossible to enter. They fled back to the river. It had merged again. The village was gone. In France, monks recorded water wells that poured endlessly without filling buckets. Yet the water never overflowed. Some claimed drinking it caused visions, of birds flying backward, trees bending, the sun rising in reverse. Others who drank it reported no effect. The well seemed selective. Rivers and seas also reflected celestial anomalies. Stars above rivers sometimes doubled or appeared underwater. Moonlight caused ripples, formed shapes, circles, spirals, even letters that faded before being read. Animals reacted first. Dogs barked, horses reared, fish jumped, birds fled. People began to fear water as much as fire, forests and stars. Water was alive. Water was deliberate. And worst of all, water remembered. Footprints in mud were erased. Bodies submerged in rivers appeared elsewhere. Dead animals floated to unfamiliar shores. Fishermen caught fish they had not seen before, creatures of impossible size, translucent, moving unnaturally. One account describes a child slipping into a shallow stream. Villagers searched for hours. The child emerged half an hour later, unharmed, claiming to have walked through a world of silver water, where gravity and sound were reversed. And fish spoke in voices humans understood, but could not remember. The monks concluded that water was not passive. It responded to humans. It tested them, it punished and rewarded. Time, space, and logic all bent in water. One chronicler ended his account with a warnings. Do not trust the rivers, the lakes or the seas. They are alive, they move. They observe. They choose. And when you step into them, you may not return the same. Medieval people believed the winds were messengers of the divine. They blew to carry scents, spread clouds, or warn of storms. Sailors studied them. Farmers feared them. Travelers relied upon them to guide sails and wagons. And yet eyewitness accounts describe winds that acted independently, winds that carried impossible sounds, moved contrary to logic, and seemed aware of human presence. The earliest record comes from a coastal village in France. A gentle breeze blew from the north as usual, carrying salt and seaweed. Villagers noticed something strange. The wind carried whispers. No human voices, no echoes from nearby cottages. Just whispers in a language they did not understand. The villagers tried to ignore it. Some covered their ears. Others ran indoors. The whispers continued. They grew louder yet always moved away from the source. A child reached out to touch the air. The wind recoiled. Leaves spun away in small tornadoes around him, never touching his skin. The chronicler wrote that the wind was aware. In Germany, soldiers on patrol encountered gusts that shifted direction with intention. A strong northern wind suddenly reversed, pushing their wagons backward against a slope. The horses struggled as if something unseen pulled the reins. The soldiers shouted, cursed, and prayed. The wind obeyed none of them. It twisted around obstacles, entered tents and vanished in a perfect swirl above their heads. In England, farmers reported winds that carried objects, straw, twigs, and small stones lifted without visible turbulence. The objects hovered, then descended far from their original locations. One villager reported seeing a loaf of bread float above the village square, remaining suspended for hours, before landing on the roof of a stranger's house. People feared what the wind would do next. In Italy, chroniclers wrote of a wind that responded to human emotion. Laughter caused small breezes, anger caused violent gusts. Fear intensified the wind. A monk described meditating outdoors when a sudden breeze twisted around him, lifting his robes and spinning leaves in concentric circles. He felt watched. The wind was deliberate. Children again noticed these anomalies first. They played outside and pointed to invisible hands moving the air. Adults laughed, until the wind blew away personal belongings. Coins disappeared, hats flew off, doors slammed without cause. Some winds seemed intelligent. In Spain, villagers described winds that carried glimpses of the future. Dust swirled into patterns, a man foy uprooting, a child laughing in a field. Those who saw these visions sometimes avoided them, sometimes ignored them, but events unfold exactly as the wind had shown. The church feared such accounts. Prediction by wind could not exist, only God ordained knowledge of the future. One chronicler wrote of a storm where the wind created impossible paths. It tore along hills, swirled through valleys, lifted livestock briefly, and vanished instantly. Survivors described walking through areas untouched by rain or wind, though nearby fields were destroyed. In Ireland, fishermen on the coast described a breeze that moved against the tide, lifting waves before reversing them, leaving the sea calm behind them. The wind also carried scents of flowers growing in lands far away. Travelers reported that the wind seemed to test them. Step forward, and it pushed back. Step aside, and it pulled gently. Speak aloud, and it echoed your words differently, sometimes slower, sometimes in a slightly altered tone. In Germany, monks recorded winds that carried visions during prayer. The chapel doors would rattle, candles flickered yet no draft existed. The air seemed thick, like it had weight. Those inside experienced visions of impossible architecture, of cities in the sky, of stars forming symbols in alignment with the chapel windows. In France, children played near the meadows when a sudden gust carried them upwards briefly, like a lift, and then deposited them gently on the grass. No injury occurred. Some children laughed. Others were silent, staring at the trees. Adults noticed that winted to hierarchy. The wealthier or more powerful the observer, the calmer the wind. The poorer or more fearful, the wilder it became. In Italy, a monk wrote that during a severe windstorm, the air shimmered with light. Sparks danced along the gusts like fireflies. Some tried to catch them, but the sparks moved around their hands, never touching. Witnesses claimed they felt pressure in their chests. Their bones vibrated subtly. Even the air itself seemed aware of their intentions. One villager described chasing a swirl of wind across a field. It moved precisely away from him almost playfully. When he stopped, the swirl waited, then moved again. In Spain, chroniclers recorded the wind influencing sound. Bells chimed in response to the direction of gusts. Voices carried further than possible. Footsteps appeared to echo miles away. Birds repeated songs in unnatural synchrony with gusts. Water and wind interacted in strange ways. Rivers rose when winds blew in precise patterns, even absent storms. Boats were lifted briefly, as if the water itself had obeyed the wind. In England, chroniclers wrote that some winds could bend light. Sunlight filtered through gusts, creating shimmering illusions. Observers swore they saw distant lands reflected in the air. One monk wrote, "The wind is neither spirit nor beast. It moves, it chooses. It shapes the world. And when it comes for you, you will know it has remembered." The final recorded account in the chapter describes a village, where the wind formed a door. A breeze blew through the square, twisting leaves into an archway. Villagers stepped through, only to emerge in a field not of their world, with colors, sounds, and shapes that defied understanding. Some returned. Others disappeared. The chronicler ended the report with a warning. Fear the winds, not for their strength, but for their awareness. They observe, they respond, they remember, and what they carry may not belong to you. Medieval people believed that fire obeyed rules. It burned what it touched. It consumed wood, straw and flesh. It needed fuel. It needed air. Yet eyewitness accounts describe fire behaving independently, moving against logic, consuming what it chose, or refusing to burn at all. Fire that seemed aware, purposeful, and intelligent. The earliest record comes from a village in southern France. One evening, a barn caught fire. Villagers rushed to extinguish it, but the flames behaved oddly. They spread quickly along one side, leaving hay untouched. They climbed walls, skipped across beams, then halted midair. Fire should consume everything in its path. This fire did not. Villagers noticed shapes in the flames, moving figures, faint silhouettes of people, animals, even structures. They flickered like shadows but were not shadows. One man approached with a torch. The flames receded. When he moved away they returned, dancing with deliberate patterns. Monks recorded the event. They described seeing letters in the fire, briefly forming words no one could read. The letters vanished before comprehension. In England, chroniclers reported a hearth fire that refused to ignite. The logs were dry, the bellows worked nothing, until a child whispered into the flames. The fire responded. It leapt, crackled, then split into multiple small flames, hovering inches above the haft. The fire retreated playfully, then settled. Adults were alarmed. In Germany, soldiers observed campfires that moved across the ground leaving no trace. Flames lifted small rocks, jumped over tents, and merged into shapes that resembled humans or animals. Witnesses swore they saw the fire watching them. Fire was not neutral. In Italy, a monk described candles burning backward. The wax reformed on the wick as flames climbed downward. Smoke vanished. Heat was absent. When observers touched the wax, it melted normally, but the flames continued to climb the wick. Villagers interpreted this as a warning. Priests attempted exorcisms. The candles resisted. In Spain, chroniclers described lightning that struck without thunder. Sparks danced along rooftops, avoiding some buildings entirely while focusing on others. The lightning appeared deliberate, testing, almost intelligent. It consumed objects selectively, leaving nearby structures untouched. Animals reacted violently. Birds refused to perch. One chronicler wrote that fire often coincided with stars and winds behaving strangely. When celestial anomalies occurred, fire acted differently. Hearths burned unevenly, candles split, torches hovered, lightning moved unnaturally. In France, villagers saw torches floating in the streets. They followed observers, responding to gestures, fading when approached. One chronicler described seeing multiple torches form a spiral in the air, as if drawing a path to some unseen location. People dared not enter the spiral. In England, a fire in a forge consumed metal, not wood. The smith struck iron with hammer and fire, yet the flames ignored his bellows. Sparks danced, sometimes forming figures resembling men, horses, or mythical beasts. The smith recorded that the iron glowed unevenly, as if the flames were shaping it deliberately. In Germany, a village described fires that healed wounds. A child burnt her hand, but the flames did not scar. A man cut himself, the fire licked the wound, and the flesh knit unnaturally. The monks feared that fire's agency threatened divine order. Fire is meant to destroy, not repair. Some fires resisted extinguishing. Monks poured water, stomped flames, yet fires flickered elsewhere. They were unpredictable. They moved, observing reactions. In Italy, chroniclers noted fires that emitted voices. A hearth fire whispered prayers, even warnings. Some who heard the voices were driven mad. Others became obsessed, spending hours listening. The most disturbing account comes from Ireland. A massive fire swept through a forest, yet some trees remained untouched. Animals fled, villagers panicked, yet one man reported seeing a figure of light within the flames, walking calmly, untouched by the fire. The figure raised its hand. Flames around it bent and shifted. When it disappeared, the fire spread naturally, consuming everything. People said the figure was neither angel nor human. It was fire. Or the fire was it. In France, chroniclers observed that fire remembered humans. Houses touched by fire in past years sometimes caught again, while nearby buildings remained untouched. Fire returned, selective, purposeful, observing memory. Monks concluded that fire was alive. It responded. It tested. It punished. It rewarded. In England, villagers reported embers floating toward those they disliked, landing on clothing or skin without burning, only leaving warmth. When the embers touched someone deemed innocent, they vanished. In Spain, fires accompanied visions. Flames reflected impossible architecture, distorted landscapes, and figures in motion that did not exist. Observers could not describe them accurately. Language failed. Animals reacted first. Dogs whined, horses bolted, birds fled. Humans followed instinctively. Children, as usual, noticed first. They played near campfires and whispered. Flames responded, leaping, bending, forming small patterns that seemed alive. Monks warned parents not to let children near fire alone. Some fires seemed tied to celestial events. Certain stars or winds preceding fire anomalies coincided with flames behaving unpredictably, splitting, hovering, shaping, disappearing. One monk wrote that fire was both a door and a mirror, reflecting what humans feared or desired, shaping itself deliberately. The final account describes a bonfire at a village festival. Flames rose higher than ever, splitting into hundreds of small columns. Each column moved independently, forming a massive circle above the village square. Villagers stood paralyzed, watching shapes emerge within the circle, silhouettes of humans, animals, and impossible creatures. When the bonfire extinguished naturally, the villagers felt as though something left with the smoke, something alive, watching, remembering. The chronicler ended the report with a warning. Do not trust fire. Not for warmth, not for light, not for fuel. It sees, it moves, it chooses. And when it watches you, you may not remain the same,